Some killers don't hide in shadows. They build their own stage. They act normal, speak gently, and wear the kind of smiles you'd never question. But behind that mask, they're hunters, from quiet neighborhoods to isolated back roads, from offices to small-town diners. These 6 killers didn't just take lives. They designed their crimes like stories, controlling every chapter until the very end. These are 6 disturbing serial killers you've never heard of, and each one is darker than the last. Before we begin, tell us what country you're watching from in the comments. Please subscribe if you want more stories like this, because what you're about to hear, you won't find it on Netflix. His name was Frank Delaney, and for 20 years he was the school janitor no one noticed. He swept floors, changed light bulbs, and fixed broken desks. But behind that simple job, Frank was watching, waiting, and building his own set of rules. He killed for control. As a child, he had been ignored, invisible to teachers and classmates. As an adult, he turned that invisibility into a weapon. Frank targeted drifters and hitchhikers who passed near Hollow Pines High School late at night. He lured them inside by offering shelter, food, or a place to sleep when storms rolled through. Most trusted him. He looked tired but harmless, a man in gray overalls with a ring of keys. Once inside, Frank's method was simple but efficient. He locked the heavy school doors and led his victims to the boiler room, a place no one else entered after dark. His weapon of choice was a crowbar, heavy, silent, easy to explain as janitor's tools. He struck fast, leaving victims with no chance to fight back. He killed not out of rage, but out of ritual. Each murder followed the same steps: lure, trap, strike, and silence. Why did he do it? Frank later claimed that killing made him feel like he was rewriting his past, forcing the world to finally pay attention. Each victim became a symbol of the people who had overlooked him. For disposal, Frank used the very building he worked in. Beneath Hollow Pines was an old maintenance tunnel, built decades earlier but sealed off from students and staff. Frank reopened it, creating his own hidden graveyard. He dragged bodies into the tunnel, wrapping them in plastic tarps stolen from the gym storage. No one suspected a thing. Teachers saw him carrying bags at night and assumed he was hauling garbage. The school became his hunting ground and hiding place in one. For years, victims vanished from highways and alleys near town, with police baffled. Nobody thought to look beneath the school floor where the janitor hummed softly as he swept the halls. For years, Frank Delaney's crimes stayed invisible, hidden under the very floors he swept every night. But arrogance always leaves cracks. His downfall began when a new security system was installed at Hollow Pines High. Cameras were placed in hallways, not to catch a killer, but to stop vandalism. Frank didn't care at first. He knew every corner of the school, every blind spot. But one night, while dragging a heavy bag into the basement, he forgot the new camera by the east stairwell. The recording didn't show the murder, but it showed something strange. The janitor moving a bag far too heavy for garbage, disappearing into a section of the building supposedly sealed decades earlier. When staff reviewed footage after a student prank, they saw the odd clip and quietly handed it to police. That was the first thread pulled. Investigators didn't rush in. They studied Frank's routines. They checked missing persons cases around town and noticed a strange pattern. Many had vanished within a mile of Hollow Pines. Police asked about Frank in town, and the answers were always the same: quiet, hardworking, forgettable. He wasn't on anyone's radar, and that invisibility was what had made him dangerous. Finally, detectives got a warrant to search the tunnels. What they found turned Hollow Pines into a crime scene that shocked the state. Beneath the school, hidden under layers of dust and cobwebs, were tarped bundles stacked like storage. When opened, they revealed skeletons, clothing, and personal items from victims missing for over a decade. The discovery broke the case wide open. Teachers who had worked beside Frank wept in disbelief. Parents demanded answers, asking how so many deaths could have been ignored. Prosecutors built their case not just on the remains, but also on Frank's own journals. Hidden in his janitor's closet was a notebook where he logged each kill, marking them with the phrase, "Another lesson finished." He described how he lured victims, how long they lasted, and how he felt in the silence afterward. The notebook wasn't gore-filled, but it was cold, a catalog of control, proof that every killing was planned. During the trial, Frank sat stone-faced. He admitted nothing, denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described how he was always alone at night, how he patrolled the school like a warden. One former student testified that Frank once warned him, "Don't wander the halls after dark. You might not come back." At the time, it was brushed off as a joke. In court, it sounded like a confession. The jury took only hours to convict him on multiple counts of murder. Frank was sentenced to life without parole. The school closed for a year, then was permanently shut down. Hollow Pines High was demolished, the land left vacant. Families of victims demanded it remain untouched, calling it cursed ground. For the town, the betrayal cut deep. A man trusted to clean and protect had used the school as his hunting ground. Children who once laughed in the gym or studied in the library now learned their classrooms had stood above a tomb. In prison, Frank refused interviews, refusing to give the world answers. When asked why he killed, he simply said, "Because no one else listened." That was his truth. Invisibility turned into vengeance. He died years later behind bars, unrepentant, taking with him the names of victims he never recorded. For investigators, Frank Delaney became a textbook case of camouflage, a man who blended into routine so perfectly that nobody thought to suspect the janitor with keys to every locked door. If Frank Delaney turned a school into his hunting ground, the next killer turned highways into his trap. He didn't sweep floors or carry keys. He carried rope and promises. Truckers used to say that if you broke down on Route 19 after midnight, you were safer walking 10 miles in the dark than waiting for help. That warning came from whispers about one man, a drifter named Charles Merrick, later called the Highway Collector. He wasn't a mechanic or a driver, but he spent his life circling lonely stretches of road across 3 states. To passing strangers, Merrick looked helpful, a wiry man with a pickup full of tools, offering rides or a hand with a flat tire. But behind his friendly voice was a predator who hunted travelers in the most vulnerable moments of their journey. He killed because highways gave him freedom. No neighbors, no witnesses, no cameras. Just a stranger, a broken car, and a man with rope in his truck. Merrick's lures were always practical. He watched for stranded drivers, mostly women traveling alone or hitchhikers with little to defend themselves. He'd pull up slow, roll down his window and say, "Need a hand? I've got tools in the back." Most agreed because refusing help in the middle of nowhere felt riskier than trusting him. Once victims climbed into his truck or leaned near the hood, the trap was set. Merrick carried rope coiled neatly behind his seat, duct tape in the glove box, and a hammer by the door. He didn't shout or rush. He moved quick, silent, practiced. Within minutes, his victims were powerless, driven away from the highway they thought would save them. Why did Merrick kill? Later investigations suggested it was about ownership. He wanted souvenirs, something to prove control over strangers he met only once. That's why police later called him the Collector. He carried small boxes in his truck, each lined with items stolen from victims, jewelry, watches, even license plates. To him, the objects mattered more than the lives. Each item was proof that he had turned a random encounter into something permanent. Unlike other killers, Merrick didn't chase headlines. He thrived on being forgotten. His killings were fast, his victims buried shallow near abandoned rest stops or old motels. With no consistent weapon, sometimes rope, sometimes hammer, sometimes knife, investigators struggled to link the crimes. And for years, the highways kept swallowing people with no explanation. But here's where it gets really interesting. Merrick never stayed in one town. He lived out of motels, paid cash, and left before locals remembered his name. His routine made him nearly invisible. Police chasing one disappearance in Kentucky never thought to connect it to another in Ohio or Pennsylvania. By the time suspicions grew, Merrick was already in a new state, circling fresh roads, hunting for new prey. For the drivers who vanished on Route 19, their last mistake was trusting the man with the toolbox in the back of his truck. For more than a decade, Charles Merrick drifted from road to road, a ghost hiding in plain sight. But no ghost stays invisible forever. His mistake started the same way many of his crimes did, with a stranded driver. Only this time, the driver wasn't alone. A young woman's car had broken down on Route 19, and while Merrick pulled up with his usual calm routine, a second car arrived minutes later, a friend she had called for help. The friend spotted Merrick's rope lying across the front seat and noticed how fast he reached for it. Suspicion replaced trust. When Merrick sped away, the friend gave police the best lead they had ever received. A full description of his truck, down to a dented bumper sticker. Investigators launched a multi-state search, cross-referencing reports of missing drivers and travelers. Patterns began to surface. Every stretch of highway where Merrick's truck was spotted matched a disappearance within weeks. Detectives pieced together gas receipts, motel sign-in books, and toll booth records. They noticed his habit of paying cash and leaving no forwarding address. But here's where it got interesting. One motel clerk remembered Merrick leaving behind a shoebox in his room. Inside were trinkets, rings, watches, keys, even a license plate with blood still on its edge. That shoebox cracked his disguise wide open. The souvenirs weren't just trophies, they were proof. Police finally caught Merrick at a rest stop outside Columbus, Ohio. In the back of his truck, they found more boxes, each carefully labeled with dates and initials. The discovery shocked even hardened investigators. Merrick had documented his kills like a collector cataloging rare coins. The rope, duct tape, and hammer were still within arm's reach, waiting for the next victim. During questioning, Merrick barely spoke. He offered no apologies, no explanations, only the chilling line. They needed to be remembered somehow. At trial, prosecutors laid out the souvenirs one by one, showing jurors how every object connected to a missing person. Families in the courtroom gasped as necklaces and rings were held up, items they recognized immediately. Merrick's defense tried to argue he was simply a thief, not a killer. But the shallow graves investigators had uncovered near abandoned motels told another story. Each grave contained remains that matched the initials carved into his boxes. It was undeniable. The jury convicted him on multiple counts of murder and kidnapping. Merrick was sentenced to life without parole, his days of drifting highways over forever. Even in prison, he remained cold, never admitting guilt, never giving closure to families still searching for loved ones. To this day, Route 19 carries his legend, the warning whispered by truckers, the uneasy silence drivers feel when their car slows at night. Merrick's name became shorthand for a simple but chilling truth. Sometimes the hand offering help on the roadside is the very danger you need to escape. If Charles Merrick used highways as his trap, the next killer built his from faith. He wasn't a drifter with rope. He was a preacher with promises that turned deadly. On Sundays, people filled the old wooden church in Silent Mercy, a small rural town. They came for hymns, for sermons, and for the warm smile of Pastor Eli Carver. To his congregation, Carver was a man of faith, a shepherd guiding the lost. But to the outsiders, he lured with holy words. He was something else, a predator disguised as a preacher. His killings began not with violence but with scripture. He targeted wanderers, the poor, and the desperate, people who came to him in need of guidance or shelter. Carver offered prayers, food, and a place to sleep in the rectory. What no one realized was that the preacher believed death was the ultimate sermon, and he alone was chosen to deliver it. Carver's method was calculated. He would invite strangers into his study, speaking gently about redemption and sin. He built trust with calm words and the promise of salvation. Once his guests were seated, he closed the doors and revealed his other tools: ropes hidden under pew cushions, iron candlesticks by his desk, and sedatives mixed into cups of wine he served as sacrament. His weapon of choice was often the candlestick, heavy enough to silence quickly, but he also relied on strangulation with cords meant for church bells. To Carver, these weren't just tools, they were symbols. He believed his killings were purifying acts, removing sinners from the world one at a time. Why did he kill? Carver's journals, discovered years later, explained his twisted motive. He claimed he was cleansing souls, that every victim was a sacrifice to keep evil away from silent mercy. But buried under those justifications was pride. Carver enjoyed control, the absolute power of deciding who lived and who died. Unlike other predators who acted in rage, Carver performed his killings like rituals. He recited scripture as he acted, pausing to mark passages in his Bible, underlining phrases like, "Deliver us from evil." For him, murder wasn't chaos, it was worship. Disposal of bodies was another part of his sermon. Carver buried victims in unmarked graves behind the church cemetery, blending them among the forgotten. He dug at night, wearing his priest's collar, humming hymns under his breath. No one questioned why fresh dirt appeared. Cemeteries always had new graves, and Carver kept records vague. To families of the missing, victims had simply vanished on the road. No one imagined they were lying under church soil, a few feet away from the righteous who had died naturally. For years, Carver's camouflage worked perfectly. The church bells rang every Sunday, hymns filled the air, and beneath it all, Silent Mercy's preacher continued his hidden ritual of death. For years, Eli Carver preached on Sundays and killed in silence during the week, and no one dared question him. He was respected, trusted, even admired. But arrogance always leaves cracks, and Carver's undoing began with something small. One evening, a teenage runaway arrived at the church doors. Carver welcomed him as he had done with others, offering food, warmth, and a sermon. But the boy was cautious. He noticed Carver locking doors behind him, noticed the way the preacher's eyes lingered on the ropes tucked under a pew. When Carver poured him wine, the boy pretended to sip, then slipped the cup aside. Hours later, while Carver prayed in another room, the boy fled through a window. He ran straight to a highway patrol officer, blurting out every detail of what he had seen: the ropes, the wine, the strange talk about sacrifice. That single escape broke Carver's wall of silence. Investigators entered Silent Mercy Church days later, expecting to find nothing more than odd habits. Instead, they uncovered evidence that turned suspicion into certainty. In Carver's private study, they found journals filled with names, dates, and verses of scripture scrawled beside each entry. The names matched missing persons reports from nearby towns, travelers, runaways, women who had last been seen near Silent Mercy. In the church cellar, police discovered fresh dirt piled against a wall. When they dug, they unearthed bones wrapped in fragments of robes, rosary beads tangled among the remains. Forensic teams searched the cemetery and found at least a dozen shallow, unmarked graves that didn't belong to any official record. Each one tied Carver to the disappearances that had haunted the region for years. The trial captured national attention, not because of gore, but because of betrayal. Parishioners filled the courtroom, struggling to reconcile the man who baptized their children with the man prosecutors called a murderer in holy cloth. The evidence was overwhelming. Carver's own handwriting connected him to victims. Survivors described strange encounters with him, times he pressed them to stay after services, times he quoted scripture with unsettling intensity. One chilling piece of testimony came from the runaway who had escaped. He told the jury, "He prayed as he tried to bind me. He said I was chosen. I just didn't want to find out what for." His words painted Carver as not just a killer, but a manipulator who twisted faith into a trap. Carver sat calm throughout the proceedings, rarely speaking. When asked why he killed, he quoted scripture again. "The wages of sin is death." He never showed remorse, never admitted guilt, but never denied it either. It was as if he believed conviction in a human court meant nothing compared to his own warped sense of divine mission. The jury, however, had no doubts. They found him guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Inside prison walls, Carver continued to preach, gathering small groups of inmates who listened more out of curiosity than belief. Guards reported that he would sit alone in his cell at night, reading his Bible aloud, underlining new verses in red ink. He died behind bars years later, never admitting the full number of his victims, taking with him secrets buried in the soil of silent mercy. For the town, the betrayal lingered. Families avoided the church, which was eventually torn down. Locals called the empty lot the ground of false faith, a reminder that even the symbols of safety can be turned into tools of fear. If Eli Carver twisted faith into a weapon, the next killer twisted charm. He wasn't a preacher or a drifter. He was the friendly neighbor everyone trusted until they vanished. On Maple Street, everyone knew Daniel Harker. He was the man who mowed his lawn on Saturdays, shoveled snow for older residents in the winter, and always waved with a smile. He seemed ordinary, dependable, the kind of neighbor people trusted with spare keys or asked to water plants when they left for vacation. But behind that easy smile, Daniel was studying people. He wasn't interested in friendship. He was hunting. His killings began with curiosity, a fascination with control, and grew into a pattern so quiet that no one suspected a thing until it was far too late. Daniel's lure was his reputation. He helped willingly, without asking for anything in return. Neighbors often invited him into their homes, either for coffee or to fix a leaky faucet. That trust became his opening. He chose victims who lived alone, widows, single tenants, newcomers with no close ties. Once inside, he pretended to fix something or carry groceries, all the while noting locks, windows, and routines. When the moment came, his weapon of choice was simple: a length of cord he carried in his jacket pocket. It was fast, quiet, and left little behind. To Daniel, the act wasn't about rage, but about possession. He later admitted he wanted to own the quiet street, to prove every home could belong to him if he decided. Why did he kill? Daniel's background revealed a man who felt powerless in every other part of life. He worked low-paying jobs, was overlooked socially, and carried years of resentment. Murder gave him a sense of mastery he lacked elsewhere. He planned carefully, waiting weeks before striking. He timed his visits so victims wouldn't be missed right away. Holidays, weekends, or evenings when families thought their loved one had simply gone out. His disposal method was just as meticulous. Daniel used the neighborhood itself as cover. He buried some victims beneath sheds, others in shallow pits disguised as garden projects. To anyone passing by, he looked like a helpful neighbor fixing up yards, but in reality, he was hiding secrets only feet away from barbecues and block parties. The scariest part? For years, no one questioned him. Missing neighbors were chalked up to moves, travel, or sudden disappearances. Daniel blended perfectly into suburban life, his crimes hidden behind picket fences and polite nods. Maple Street was his hunting ground, and no one realized the predator lived right next door. For years, Maple Street trusted Daniel Harker without hesitation. He walked dogs for neighbors, brought in mail during vacations, and never raised suspicion. But like all killers who think they're untouchable, Daniel slipped. His mistake began with impatience. He targeted a young tenant named Claire who had just moved into the corner apartment. She wasn't close to anyone yet, and Daniel believed no one would notice her absence. But Claire's sister checked in daily by phone. When the calls went unanswered, she came by. What she found planted the first seeds of doubt. Claire's door unlocked, her groceries still fresh on the counter, and Daniel across the street mowing his lawn at night. That detail, mowing at 9 in the evening, when no one else did, burned in her memory. She reported it to police, mentioning his too eager presence during her search. Detectives took interest. They interviewed neighbors and discovered Daniel always seemed nearby when someone went missing. He was helpful, almost too helpful, suggesting places to search or theories about why they vanished. His name appeared again and again in reports, always at the edges of disappearances. Police obtained a warrant and searched his property. What they found ended Maple Street's illusion of safety. In Daniel's shed, hidden beneath bags of fertilizer, officers uncovered clothing, jewelry, and house keys that belonged to missing residents. Behind his garage, in a patch of dirt he claimed was for new garden beds, investigators dug up remains wrapped in tarp. The evidence connected him to at least 4 disappearances. At trial, the community packed the courthouse. Friends and neighbors who once trusted Daniel now stared at him with disbelief and anger. Prosecutors described how he used trust as bait, how he lured victims by fixing small problems before becoming the biggest one himself. They displayed items taken from his shed, each one tied to a name and a missing person. The most haunting moment came when Claire's sister testified. She said, "He smiled at me while I was searching for her. He even offered to help, and all the while, she was already gone." That single line captured Daniel's deception better than any evidence. The jury took less than a day to find him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life without parole. In prison, Daniel remained unrepentant. He claimed he had proven ownership of Maple Street and seemed almost proud that no one had noticed for so long. For the town, the betrayal left scars. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. The street emptied over the next few years as families moved away, unable to live where they once believed they were safe. The house Daniel lived in was abandoned, boarded up, and eventually torn down. What remained was an empty lot, and the memory that sometimes the predator isn't a stranger in the shadows, but the neighbor who smiles over the fence. If Daniel Harker used friendliness as his disguise, the next killer used fire. He wasn't a janitor, a drifter, or a preacher. He was an arsonist who turned flames into murder. In Red Valley, fires were nothing unusual. The dry summers often sparked small blazes in fields or abandoned barns. People assumed nature was to blame until the fires started following a pattern. Each one happened late at night in houses at the edge of town, homes occupied by people who lived alone. At first, neighbors pitied the victims, thinking they'd died tragically in accidents. But the truth was darker. The flames were not accidents. They were the work of Thomas Rayner, a quiet handyman who lived on the outskirts. Known for fixing fences and repairing sheds, Thomas blended into town life easily. But in secret, he saw fire not as destruction, but as purification. He killed because fire gave him control. It erased evidence, silenced screams, and left nothing but ash. Rayner's lures were simple. He often volunteered to check homes for safety issues, warning residents about faulty wiring or old chimneys. People trusted him. He was helpful, polite, and seemed knowledgeable. After gaining entry, he studied layouts, exits, and weak points. Later, when the timing was right, he returned under cover of darkness. His weapons weren't knives or guns. They were matches, gasoline, and rags twisted into makeshift torches. Rayner moved silently, pouring fuel along doorways and hallways, trapping victims inside. By the time smoke filled their lungs, escape was nearly impossible. He didn't strike at random. He chose people who were isolated, those whose deaths wouldn't immediately draw suspicion. Why them? Because Rayner believed he was cleansing the valley, removing what he saw as burdens or sinners. In his twisted logic, fire was a tool of justice. Disposal was built into his method. Unlike killers who had to hide bodies, Rayner let the flames do the work. Fire consumed victims, destroyed belongings, and left investigators guessing. In most cases, coroners could barely identify remains, and the official reports listed accidental fire as the cause of death. This gave Rayner confidence. Each blaze reinforced his belief that he was smarter than authorities, that his method made him untouchable. For years, he kept striking, one fire after another, always leaving behind the same blackened ruins and a town grieving accidents that were never accidents at all. For years, Thomas Rayner's fires looked like accidents, written off as tragedies of faulty wiring and careless mistakes. But like every predator who grows too confident, he made errors. His undoing began when he struck twice in the same week. The first blaze destroyed an old farmhouse. The second, only 3 nights later, took the life of a widow living alone on the far edge of town. 2 tragedies in such a short time raised suspicion. Investigators from the state fire marshal's office were called in, and unlike local authorities, they didn't accept coincidence. They noticed burn patterns that suggested accelerants, not natural causes. Traces of gasoline were found on a floor beam that should have collapsed long before the fire spread. Quietly, suspicion shifted from accidents to arson. Detectives began looking at people who had easy access to homes and knowledge of their weaknesses. Thomas Rayner's name surfaced quickly. He had been present at nearly every fire scene, often arriving before the flames were fully out. He claimed he was just helping neighbors, but witnesses remembered seeing his truck near houses only hours before they burned. Investigators dug deeper. They discovered that Rayner had purchased large amounts of gasoline and rags in the weeks before the blazes. They also found a notebook in his shed, filled with sketches of homes in Red Valley, with markings near doorways and exits. Each sketch matched a property that had later gone up in flames. When police confronted Rayner, he stayed calm, denying everything. But the evidence kept building. In his workshop, officers found a box of matches identical to those used at fire scenes, along with gloves soaked in fuel. The final piece came from a survivor. One woman, trapped in a fire, managed to escape through a window. She told investigators she had seen a man watching from the street as her house burned, and she recognized him as the handyman who had offered to check her wiring a week earlier. That testimony sealed his fate. At trial, prosecutors laid out his pattern clearly. They showed the jury maps of Red Valley, with pins marking every fire. All were connected to Rayner in some way: jobs he had done, warnings he had given, neighbors he had offered to help. They presented his notebook, his purchases, and the survivor's account. The picture was undeniable. Thomas Rayner was no concerned handyman. He was the arsonist who had turned fire into his weapon of choice. Rayner never admitted guilt. He sat through the trial expressionless, sometimes smiling faintly when photographs of burned homes were shown. When asked why he had done it, he replied only once, saying, "Fire is the only truth. It never lies." The jury needed little time to convict him. He was sentenced to life without parole, locked away where no match or gasoline could ever touch his hands again. For Red Valley, the scars lasted. Families who had lost loved ones in the fires could no longer see flames the same way. Every bonfire, every smell of smoke, brought memories of the arsonist who lived among them. His house was torn down after the trial, the lot left empty as a reminder of what he had stolen. Even today, locals still say his name in whispers, warning children not to linger near empty buildings at night because the arsonist of Red Valley might return. If Thomas Rayner used fire as his disguise, the next killer used kindness. He wasn't a handyman or preacher. He was a doctor, and his medicine wasn't meant to heal. In the small town of Ashbrook, Dr. Leonard Shaw was trusted by nearly everyone. He was the kind of physician who still made house calls, driving out late at night to check on patients too weak to visit his clinic. To neighbors, he was dedicated, selfless, and reliable. But behind his stethoscope and soft-spoken manner, Shaw carried a secret far darker than anyone imagined. He didn't just treat the sick. He selected victims from his own patients, choosing those he believed no one would question if they suddenly passed in their sleep. Shaw killed not out of rage, but for curiosity. He wanted to test how far he could go under the protection of his profession, and each victim was a grim experiment disguised as medical care. Shaw's lures were the very things that made people trust him: his medical bag, his promise of help, his calm bedside manner. When he arrived at homes, patients welcomed him in without hesitation. They believed the doctor would ease their pain. Instead, he used his tools as weapons. Inside his bag, alongside syringes and medicine bottles, were carefully prepared vials. Some contained sedatives strong enough to render patients unconscious. Others were mixtures of drugs that stopped hearts silently, leaving little trace. He injected his victims under the guise of treatment, smiling gently, whispering reassurances while administering doses that were never meant to heal. Why did he do it? Later notes in his private journal revealed he saw himself as the hand of mercy, convincing himself he was deciding who deserved to live and who deserved a peaceful end. But his true motive was power, the thrill of ending life while everyone still believed he was saving it. For years, Dr. Leonard Shaw walked through the doors of his patients' homes at midnight, leaving behind grief that looked natural, even expected. When elderly patients died suddenly, no one raised an eyebrow. When middle-aged patients with minor illnesses failed to recover, families simply trusted Shaw's explanations about hidden complications. His medical reports always looked tidy, signed with authority, filled with language no ordinary person dared question. For a long time, that mask of professionalism kept him safe. But even the most careful predators eventually stumble. Shaw's downfall began with a patient who lived longer than he expected. Her name was Margaret Tate, a widow in her late 50s who had been struggling with migraines. Shaw visited her one evening and administered what he claimed was a stronger pain reliever. Instead of slipping quietly into unconsciousness, Margaret woke hours later with blurred vision and a strange numbness in her arms. Alarmed, her daughter rushed her to the city hospital instead of calling Shaw back. There, tests revealed unusual chemical traces in her blood. Drugs not prescribed for migraines, drugs strong enough to slow a heart. Doctors reported the finding to authorities. Suspicion began to swirl around the beloved town doctor. Investigators reviewed Shaw's patient files and noticed something chilling. An unusual number of his patients had died suddenly, often after routine treatments. The timing was suspicious, but what tied the cases together was Shaw himself, always present, always the last to see them alive. Detectives obtained a warrant to search his clinic. Inside his locked cabinet, they found vials unlabeled or mislabeled, containing powerful sedatives and lethal mixtures. Even more damning were his journals. Written in precise clinical handwriting, they described each death as a case, noting dosages, times, and outcomes. One entry read, "Administered 12 milligrams. Subject passed within minutes. No resistance. Family believes natural." The coldness of the notes left investigators shaken. At trial, prosecutors painted Shaw as a predator who hid behind a white coat. They displayed his journals in court, reading entries aloud to show how deliberate the killings were. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, many in disbelief that the doctor they had trusted with their loved ones' lives had betrayed them so completely. The survivor, Margaret Tate, testified about her night with Shaw, how he smiled as he prepared the injection, how he reassured her it was safe. Her account, paired with the chemical evidence, sealed the narrative. Shaw wasn't a healer. He was a hunter who used medicine as his weapon. The defense tried to argue he had been easing suffering, that he was misguided rather than malicious. But the prosecution countered with names of younger, healthier patients who had died suddenly after Shaw's visits. They emphasized his need for control, his careful notes, and the way he disguised murder as mercy. The jury saw through the mask. After days of testimony, they convicted him on multiple counts of murder. Shaw was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In prison, he remained cold, detached, never apologizing. Guards reported he often sat in the infirmary, offering advice to medical staff as if he were still the respected doctor of Ashbrook. He died behind bars years later, his journals locked away as evidence of how far deception can reach when wrapped in trust. For Ashbrook, the betrayal lingered. Families questioned every diagnosis, every prescription, every doctor who followed. The clinic was shut down permanently, the building left to rot. The people of the town refused to rebuild, saying the walls had absorbed too much pain. Shaw's legacy wasn't just the lives he took, but the trust he destroyed. Proof that sometimes the person called in to heal is the one most eager to harm. These were 6 disturbing killers you've never heard of. What makes these killers so disturbing isn't just how they ended lives, but how long they stayed invisible. They walked among people who thought they were safe, using trust as the sharpest weapon of all. And that's what keeps their stories alive. Not gore, not shock, but the quiet reminder that the most dangerous predators often wear the friendliest masks. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because the next case, it may be even darker.